Good evening, and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. And once again, I'm pleased to welcome a really broad international audience. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest Lucy Adlington, and I'll introduce Lucy in just a few moments. A little bit of housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. You can do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. As always, we will do our best to get through as many of your questions as possible. Let me also draw your attention to the chat facility. This will allow you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. And finally, this event is being recorded. It will appear on the Milim website at milim.org.uk in the next day or so. You'll find recordings of other past events there, as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest this evening. Lucy Adlington is an author and clothes historian, as well as a keen collector of vintage and antique costume. She's written several books of both history-inspired fiction and social history. This evening, she's speaking about her book, The Dressmakers of Auschwitz. It was published in the UK just under a year ago. Lucy joins us from her farm near York. Lucy, we're all fascinated to hear what you've got to say, so I won't keep our audience any longer. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me on the farm in Yorkshire in the north of England. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with you all, to tell you something of the research, the work I've been doing over the past few years, and to introduce you to some really wonderful, really remarkable women. You can see photographs of a few of them behind me, lovely black and white portraits, most of them pre-war. So to give you a little bit of background, I am a clothes historian, and you might be thinking, well, clothes, Auschwitz, how do clothing and Holocaust history bind together? But I have to tell you, I've been writing and presenting clothes history for well over 20 years now, and clothes always tell stories, and they always hold memories. In fact, since Milim is Leeds-based, I should tell you I've just been donated a beautiful silk jersey beaded evening dress from the 1920s, and it actually has a Leeds link from the Jewish tailors Barney Bailey and Sons, who were on Briggate in Leeds. And so even a lovely frock like that, a lovely dress like that, has that both a local connection, a Yorkshire connection, but also the Jewish connection, because Mr. Bailey fled Kiev in Ukraine, turn of last century, and came to Leeds to make his way. And in fact, Leeds in Yorkshire has a long history of textile excellence and such a lot of Jewish talent and Jewish industry. So it seems very appropriate to be joining this group today. Now, in terms of clothes, telling stories and holding memories, for me, some of the greatest impact is thinking about the ways that clothing can resonate. And this often links very well with women's history. Women's history, or perhaps even working class history, isn't so well documented as elite history. So over the last 20 years, I've found it really interesting to use clothes to look into lives that haven't been so well memorialized, perhaps, or so well documented. And many years ago, possibly about 2008, I think it was, that's going back a bit, I came across reference to a fashion salon that immediately piqued my interest. It was a fashion salon, not in Leeds, not in London, Paris, New York, any of the fashion centers. It was a fashion salon in Auschwitz. And of course, I was intrigued to know more. I wanted to know, how on earth could there be a fashion salon in Auschwitz? And even more importantly, I wanted to know who'd sewn there. Now, both of my grandmothers were dressmakers, and I think many of us, we have that link in our family history: tailors, dressmakers, seamstresses, milliners. And oftentimes these skills, they perhaps get overlooked in history. If it's not high fashion, if it's not on the catwalk in Paris, sometimes sewing, tailoring, cutting, and so on, they're perhaps dismissed as, oh yes, it's just tailoring, it's just sewing. And particularly, I have to say, when it's women's work, you know, doing the sewing at home and mending and so on. But the story that has unfolded for me researching this particular fashion salon in Auschwitz has very much centered and honored the humble skill of sewing, because it is the story of young Jewish women who quite literally sewed to survive. Now, one of the women I'm going to be talking about, you can perhaps see her image here. I think I have a picture of her. Yes, perhaps this one's a little better. If I can hold that up to my camera, can you see this portrait from the 1930s? This is Hunya, or Hermine originally, Hunya Volkmann, and she was born in a little town in Czechoslovakia. And Hunya, like many young women of her generation, particularly poorer families, she learned to sew, not only at home, domestic work, but also she took an apprenticeship on. She loved it. She was really good, not only at the technical skills, but also very good at having that certain design flair. When her apprenticeship was finished, she decided that her hometown of Kežmarok was too small for her talents. So she traveled to Germany. Of course, you know, European borders, you could just travel very freely. And she set up her own salon in the city of Leipzig. And here she not only enjoyed the art and culture of the city in the 1930s, but she also gained a great reputation as a dressmaker. Hunya dressed the elite of Leipzig. She addressed Jews and non-Jews alike. They all wanted her unusual, brilliant designs. Hunya's story is one of many. And, you know, you might ask, well, how on earth did you find out about Hunya? Well, Hunya is one of the dressmakers of Auschwitz. And after initially discovering mention of this fashion salon in Auschwitz, I was very eager to know more, but it seemed like it would be impossible to find out who'd worked there. There was a fragment of testimony from Hunya that had been collected by one of the women, a fellow Auschwitz survivor, who had made it her purpose in life, if you will, in the 1980s, to gather testimonies of other women that she'd worked with during her time in the concentration camp. And thanks to this academic, Dr. Laura Shelley, we just had this little fragment of testimony in German by Hunya. And there were names that Hunya mentioned in the testimony. She mentioned Mimi, Lulu, Baba, Borishka, Marta, Bracha, Katka, Irene, Rene. But how do you track people down? Even on the wonderful databases available to us now for Holocaust research, how do you track people down from a nickname like Bracha or Mimi? So for many years, I put this idea away, and then the short version of the story is, by serendipity, series of small miracles even, the story of my research reached families in Israel. And these wonderful people contacted me and they said, well, my aunt was a dressmaker in the fashion salon in Auschwitz. My mother was a dressmaker in the fashion salon in Auschwitz. My grandmother, said one email, was head of the fashion salon in Auschwitz. And so for the first time, we had the names and the biographies and even photographs, here are some, of these young Jewish prisoners who sewed to survive in the fashion salon. So from there, it was a question of diving deep into research and, of course, lots of archive visits, video testimonies. But I had the great good fortune and privilege to be put in contact with the last surviving seamstress of the fashion salon. Her name, Bracha Burkovich. And here she is pictured with her sister Katka Burkovich. They were both from Bratislava in what became called Slovakia. So there's another Slovakian link. And they were both from a very poor family. Their father was a tailor. So Katka had already been learning tailoring skills from her father. And I had the great good fortune to fly out to San Francisco to meet Bracha in her home there and stay with her family and spend a week gathering information. And, you know, I wish I could say interviewing, but frankly, I didn't get to ask many questions in some ways because Bracha was ready to talk. She was ready to share her story, in particular to memorialize lost loved ones. She was the last surviving seamstress after all. So the tale that has been put together for this book, The Dressmakers of Auschwitz, it has been a combination of so many sources, so many fragments, including clothes, which are, of course, at the heart of this story. So what I'd like to do for maybe half an hour, 35, 40 minutes, is I'd like to give you an introduction to some more of these women. I'd like to explain how there came to be a fashion salon in a concentration camp. And I'd just like to share stories of these women's lives so their names are remembered, which is one reason that Hunya originally gave testimony. She said so their names are not forgotten. Now back to Hunya. Hunya had an expression. It was in German, but translated into English. It is, clothes make a person, rags make lice. Clothes make a person, rags make lice. So essentially, you might disregard clothes. It's just clothes, you just put them on. But actually clothes they say a great deal about us, and they're incredibly intimate. You know, they're next to our skin, very literally intimate. But they also say a lot about our culture, our gender, our society, our status. Sometimes they can give information about professions and so on. And they also, literally within their fabrics, clothes give information about technology, about the economy of a country, about trade, so much. But clothes give us dignity as well. You know, we don't want to be naked in public particularly. And so that sense of clothes make a person means that we're civilized, right? And the other part of the expression, rags make lice. And that's a lot to do with literally, you know, if you have rags, if you're poor, if you're in filthy circumstances, you know, this can breed conditions that lice thrive in. But it's also metaphorical as well. If you're in rags, you don't look as dignified, you don't have the status, and you can be treated as lice. And for a Holocaust history, this takes on particular resonance, doesn't it? We'll be very familiar with images of the Nazi elite and then the images of people they persecuted, and clothes were very much part of this. But let's go back to the idea of Hunya in Leipzig with her own fashion salon, dressing the great and the good of Leipzig. And this brings me to links between National Socialism and clothes. Now, on one level, a lot of it's about image. And let's be very clear, the Nazis knew so much about controlling image. If you think of Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, really knew how spectacle and image and overwhelm were important. But if I can show you a couple of magazines from the era, it gives you a sense of images for men and women as well. And that's all about, I suppose, controlling cultural roles. So I really love looking at primary sources from an era when I'm researching for a talk or a book. And it's quite eerie looking at publications from the National Socialist era, particularly ones, and just so you know, these are Nazi magazines. So it has quite a power to it, doesn't it, to be holding these magazines. And yet they seem so innocent. There are adverts for soap and accordions, rather bizarrely, on the back, and stockings and just household things like toothpaste. But on the front, you can see this edition of Frauenwarte, which is a Nazi women's publication. There's a very definite image of a Nazi male how the German male is meant to appear, quite monolithic, quite brutal, emotionless, and overwhelmingly military. And this magazine is from 1939. So of course, we know the significance of this type of imagery for this year. If we skip a little further ahead into the war years, I have a magazine from November 1942. And this is a women's magazine called Die Mode, fashion magazine. And you have two very stylish looking women with attractively decorated hats. And I'm showing this magazine because it's precisely this sort of women's magazine that was kept in the fashion salon at Auschwitz, which had been established by November 1942, the year of this the month of this publication. The clients of this fashion salon would come into the main room, they would browse magazines such as this, they would look at the fashions, and they would pick out designs. And then the job of a cutter, that's a particular job in tailoring and dressmaking, a cutter is to create the patterns that then are turned from fabric, two-dimensional, into your three-dimensional clothes. So these two magazines, they really show quite a contrast in images of men and women. And it is really important to look at the fashion trade if you're looking at National Socialism in the 1930s and 40s, because it's all part of the bigger picture of the Nazi drive to plunder, essentially. And during the whole course of my research for this book, I found that although bigotry, anti-Semitism, hatred, tribalism, of course, are very, very important elements to the persecution, greed is a fundamental driver for so many Nazi policies and so many choices by National Socialists. And I'm thinking in particular of the clients of the fashion salon, who were elite SS women. Not only the wives of SS families stationed at Auschwitz, the men running the camp and carrying out mass murder, but also elite women in Berlin. There was actually a 6-month waiting list for orders from the fashion salon in Auschwitz from Berlin. And these were the highest names in Berlin, said Hunya, but annoyingly, she never said which names. We can only speculate. So why would the National Socialists, why would the Nazis have any interest in the fashion trade? Well, let me emphasize that fashion is never frivolous. It may appear to be, it may appear to be just about glamour and sensuality and appearances, but fashion is a lot to do with money. And the fashion and textile industry in Europe, indeed in many countries, benefited greatly from Jewish talent and Jewish capital. So if we think of the most famous department stores in Germany, for example, they're owned and run by the most excellent entrepreneurs who are Jewish. And this goes down to the smaller boutiques and the small tailoring workshops like Hunya's and milliners and so on, shoemakers. So much talent, so much industry. And the Nazis wanted it. And they weren't prepared to endure fair competition. They wanted it for themselves by any means necessary. So I'm going to show you a couple of garments now, which will emphasize this connection between the Nazis and fashion. And this brings us a little closer to understanding how there could be a fashion salon in Auschwitz. So I can show you from my collection a very lovely dress. I hope you can see the detailing. It's a very pretty apple green crepe summer's dress, nice for the sort of summer weather that a lot of us are having. And this dress is German. It dates to about 1939. So that gives it a little context, of course. And as a dress historian, you might examine it and think, yes, detailing. And what it tells me is that this dress is from an economy that is undergoing thrift. This is not an economy of abundance. The seams are very narrow, the hem is very small and rolled, the embellishments are very modest. And this actually tallies very well with what we know about the German economy in the late 1930s. It's on a war footing, it's on military footing. And civilians are already feeling the bite, the restrictions, the lack of goods on sale. So a German dress from the late 1930s, and it seems very lovely. But if we look at the label, it has a far more sinister story to tell. So I'm holding the label, and I hope that you can see that it has an acronym, ADEFA. The ADEFA acronym stands, and if I translate it to English, for German Aryan Federation of Clothing and Textile Manufacturers. ADEFA, German Aryan. ADEFA was a federation established by a group of businessmen in a Berlin beer cellar just a few weeks after Hitler came to power in 1933. It's not a coincidence. They were directly enabled by National Socialists, the ethos, the prejudices, and the ambitions. And their aim was to render the fashion and textile trade in Germany Judenfrei, Jew-free. Now, we can hardly say these words now without realizing the ultimate implications. And groups such as ADEFA were very much part of this, these small incremental actions and laws and crimes that led to far greater horrors. ADEFA's aim was to take over Jewish businesses, to take over the factories and the weaving sheds and the boutiques and the department stores. And they did it through bullying, through forcing Jewish people to emigrate, through imitation. You know, we all know about the anti-Jewish demonstrations, don't buy from Jews, and through direct theft, Aryanization of businesses, as it was called, as in taking them over, no Jews allowed. And ADEFA also advertised to the German populace, don't buy from Jews, buy from Aryans. They emphasized that their clothes had only been made by Aryan hands, non-Jewish hands. And so Jewish artisans were put out of business. Of course, this soon went for most Jewish professions, and this wasn't just in Germany. In Slovakia, where these young women are from, ultimately, there was a pro-fascist government, an anti-Semitic government. And in line with Hitler's Nazis, they declared that Jews could not own businesses, which meant suddenly the tailors, the cobblers, the dressmakers, all Jewish business owners were without a living. They had their businesses stolen. And in the case of the young women here, perhaps I can introduce you now to Irene Reichenberg. She was friends with Bracha Burkovich in Bratislava. They lived on Żydowska Street, Jew Street, as it's called, in Bratislava. Poor as anything, but so happy. Very loving families. And Irene had the shock one day of going into school and being told, we don't want Jews here. You can't come to school anymore. And that was that. She said she went out onto the street with her Jewish friends, and she said, we did not know what to do, where to go, what to do next. And then Irene said, on the spur of the moment, I decided to learn to sew a little. And she took sewing lessons in secret, joined by her friend Renee Ungar, a rabbi's daughter, and by Bracha Burkovich. They took these sewing lessons in secret, little knowing it would save their lives. So one more ADEFA garment from Germany to show you. And I think it emphasizes how even the most innocent garments can have a story. And this one is a black wool tie from the 1930s, a man's tie. And if we open up inside, printed in, there again is the ADEFA acronym. So it really does flag up a lot about society in the 1930s, particularly in Germany. They're being bombarded with propaganda. And you would have to make that choice when you're going shopping. Are you going to brave the intimidation of brown shirts standing outside Jewish shops? Are you going to say, no, I've always shopped in this Jewish shop. I'm going in. I'm going to support my Jewish friends. Or do you say, well, I don't want to shop at that Jewish shop. I want to shop in an Aryan shop and fulfill that propaganda. So I think that's very interesting from a bystander point of view, you know, all these little acts either of support or of bigotry, can they all start adding up? But what of Hunya in Leipzig? Well, she experienced this growing enabling of anti-Semitism, and she was very much aware of the growing decrees against Jewish people and the growing infringements on their liberties. Her and her husband were very eager to leave, but like so many people, they found the doors were shut to refugees. She continued sewing in her salon as long as was possible, and eventually she too had to stop work because she was Jewish. Although the Nazis then came across a certain dilemma. Having ousted so much Jewish talent, so many Jewish artisans from the textile trade, they had a labor shortage. So having boasted, we've made the textile trade Jew-free, they then thought, right, we need Jewish laborers. And so having corralled Jewish people into ghettos and labor camps, they established factories where Jews could work clandestinely, making clothes. And I don't just mean uniforms for the Wehrmacht or the SS, although this was the case in ghettos of occupied Poland, but also civilian clothes. Civilian clothes that were then sent from ghettos in occupied Poland, they were sent to Germany and put in shops that had been taken over by Nazis, put on display, and there were no labels in them saying Jews made this. The hypocrisy of it is just revolting, isn't it? So Jewish people are being forced into making garments in return for bread, soup, and a temporary stay from deportation. And as for Hunya in Leipzig, Leipzig was a very famous fur center, and she was put into forced labor at a fur factory, Roda's fur factory, and she was reconditioning furs to send out to the Eastern Front for the Wehrmacht. But I can tell you, and you can read it in the book, she also spent a lot of time and energy helping fellow Jewish people, resisting the Nazis, and generally being completely splendid. She was a remarkable woman. In Slovakia in 1942, these young women one day at home got a message saying they had to report to a mustering point, a holding camp, for transit to work camps, they were told. These work camps, they said they would be there for a few weeks. And so these young women aged 16 to 40, they had to be single in these first transports. They had to pack. And, you know, I can't help thinking, what must it have been like? You know, you have a suitcase or a rucksack and that's it. What do you put inside? And of course, these young women packed as if they were going to work, you know, labor. So they had sturdy shoes, they had warm clothes, they had personal items from home, mementos and so on. And Irene made a very poignant observation while they were at the holding camp. She looked out of the window of the barrack blocks where they were being held one day, and she saw there was a bonfire in the yard. And this bonfire was of all the young women's identification papers. And that's when she knew something very bad was going on. Now we know now the stories of deportations and the destinations, but at the time these young women were ignorant of all of that. And in March and April 1942, when the first official Eichmann organized transports left for Auschwitz, these women were on those trains. So they were the first official Jewish transports to Auschwitz, and they were also the first female inmates in the camp. And when they arrived, my goodness, they certainly began to appreciate the power of clothes, because it's very distressing, of course, to talk about, but as we know, new arrivals in concentration camps were deliberately stripped, very violently, very aggressively, en masse in a group. And suddenly you don't have your clothes. You don't have that dignity. And also, as you take your clothes off, you're losing your connection with your home, your individuality, because the clothes do mark us out as individual, don't they? I won't dwell too long on this aspect, although I have written about it in the book, and that implication of the SS guards in their beautiful wool uniforms, and then these terrified young women with even their modesty seems to have been taken. And then their hair is taken, and then their names are taken. But I want to impress upon you that these women never forgot their names. The Nazis gave them a number, but they always remembered who they were. It was hard at times. So like many new arrivals in Auschwitz, they were put to hard labor. And I suppose you could say they were lucky. They had a chance to work, but this labor was killing them slowly. Demolition work, building the gas chambers, working in quarries, swamp clearance. And it became very clear to all the prisoners in Auschwitz and later in Birkenau when they were transferred there, that the only way they could survive was getting easier work and work indoors. And this is where the fashion salon really plays its part. And to tell you a little more about how this came about, I need to introduce you to a brilliant cutter and a brilliant human being, a wonderful human being called Marta. This is Marta Fuchs, and she had her own salon in Slovakia before the war. Of course, she was forced to close the salon. And Marta was 25 when she came to Auschwitz, so a little older than these young women. And Marta somehow was selected to go and work in the commandant's house. Now, the commandant of Auschwitz, the first and longest serving commandant, was Rudolf Huss. Rudolf Huss had married a young woman called Hedwig. And Hedwig was perfectly aligned with Rudolf's National Socialist and racial opinions. She had followed him from his SS work in Dachau and Sachsenhausen, and ultimately to Auschwitz. And along the way, she'd been having children and raising her families, living at the concentration camps, living in a lot of comfort. And by the time she came to Auschwitz, she had a house that had been stolen. She had furniture that had been stolen. She had artworks on the wall, stolen, and the very clothes she was wearing, stolen. Pure greed. And this was not limited to the commandant's family. The theft, the greed, the plunder in Nazi-occupied territories was obscene. And there were collusions from local people as well. So Hedwig Huss lived in a house next to the main camp. You can see it if you visit the Auschwitz main camp. And there's a wall that divides the garden from the original crematorium. That's it, a wall. And here she had a beautiful garden with roses and beehives and a swimming pool and a pergola, picnic tables, a child's sleigh. You know, it was just beautiful. She called it paradise. She said, I want to live here till I die. And just over the wall are the brick barracks of the Auschwitz main camp. And just maybe a couple of kilometers up the road is the newly installed extermination center of Birkenau. So Auschwitz was a place of labor originally, a place of profiteering by the SS using enslaved people. And Hedwig was no exception, actually. She had enslaved workers come and build her beautiful garden. And she also wanted Jewish talent to make her clothes. And here's where Marta comes in. Marta saw her chance, not only to have a safer job, but also to help others. So when Hedwig needed help, I think it was like upcycling some fur into a new garment, Marta said, I can do that. And Marta ended up being installed in the attic of the commandant's house, sewing beautiful clothes for the commandant's family. That's for Hedwig and all the children. But she didn't just use this position to save herself. She was very, very canny, very clever. And she said, well, there's too much work for one person. I need my friend Berta Weiss, to come and work for me. And Berta said, well, we're going to need a young girl to help out. My niece, Rojika can come and help picking up pins and sorting things. And then increasingly, Marta said, oh, I know someone who can knit for you. I know someone who can do your hair. And this wasn't because she liked Hedwig. You know, she wanted to dress her beautifully. Marta was using her privileged position to save lives. Now, eventually, other SS wives in Auschwitz, they grew jealous of the wonderful clothes that Marta was making. And they said, well, we want these fashions too. And let me tell you, they were already very adept, these women, at plundering. Because when deportees arrived in Auschwitz with their carefully packed suitcases and rucksacks, all of those goods were stolen. In fact, some of these young women, while Marta was working in the commandant's house, they found work in the vast plunder warehouses of Auschwitz and Birkenau, sorting through the clothes of murdered deportees, and many tragic stories of people finding clothes of murdered relatives and so on. And so clothes in that way, they truly do hold memories of the very, very dearest kind. But it was also, this was a chance for these young women to live. They sometimes scavenged food and live a little longer because they weren't enduring hard labor outside. But they were all growing very ill. Disease was rife. And despair also was a very real danger. In fact, Irene Reichenberg, when she was working in the plunder warehouses, was determined she was going to end her life. She'd had 3 sisters murdered. She couldn't bear, she said, why should I go on? What is there to live for? She said, the only way out is through the chimney. And her best friend Bracha said, no. She said, we are getting out of this. We are getting out and we are going to tell our story. And we are going to have coffee and cake on the Corso in Bratislava again. So that resilience was phenomenal. But as Bracha herself said, she said, you know, there were 500 seamstresses in Birkenau. If you didn't have any connections, you didn't have any luck. And Irene had connections. Through marriage, she was related to Marta. So those wonderful bonds of family were a means of getting her a place sewing for Marta. And this was no longer in the attic of the commandant's villa. This was in a dedicated fashion salon that Hedwig Huss opened in the SS administration block in the Auschwitz main camp. And here the SS wives at Auschwitz came and browsed their magazines and chose their fashions, and Marta cut and made up the fashions with help from seamstresses. And don't forget the big black order book from elite women in Berlin. And Marta knew that Irene was in trouble. She knew she was in despair. So she said, you know, I know a seamstress, Irene Reichenberg, we need her to help. And as soon as Irene came to the haven, this haven of the fashion salon, she said, well, I have a friend from Bratislava who's a very good seamstress. And this friend was Bracha. And as soon as Bracha got there, she said to Marta, you know, my sister Katka, she is a great tailor. You have to get her in. And as soon as it was possible, Marta salvaged Katka, who was actually very weak and ill at the time. It saved her life. And then they said, oh, well, there's Renee as well. And gradually, a core of 25 women were sewing in this salon. There was the making room with big wooden tables, and they're mainly sewing by hand as well. And then there was the fitting room. And this was Marta's job, was to stand with the SS clients and imagine them in, you know, they're down to their underclothing and foundation garments. And in fact, the corset specialist in the fashion salon was formerly of the French resistance. You can read about her and how she got arrested and came to the salon to make corsets for the commandant's wife. So Marta had this very uncomfortable situation of being in an intimate client and dressmaker role with the SS women. And it was her job to fit the clothes and make sure the client was happy. And in the book, you can read stories that Bracha recounted of what happens when things went wrong. Because this wasn't simply a question of, oh, the client's not happy. this is a question of life or death. If you stay in the salon, you may live. If you're thrown back into Birkenau, your chances are not good. And so, you know, that tension must have been so strong. And yet, in this salon, Marta created a haven of friendship, of camaraderie. And witness to this was Hunya. Hunya on the last train of deportees from Leipzig, who, you know, her story is wonderful. I hope you get a chance to read the book. And in July 1943, she arrived, and her number was eventually called to do a sewing audition to work in Marta's elite fashion salon. And she couldn't believe her eyes when she got there, because the prisoners had clean clothes. They had access to water. They had beds to themselves and flushing toilets. You know, those little things we take for granted, but in Auschwitz-Birkenau, these were luxurious. So all they had to do was please their SS clients. So yes, the stakes were high. They were still on starvation rations, and there was still the very real threat of illnesses. In their weakened state, they suffered from malnutrition, and also the risks of typhus and typhoid. So Hunya arrived there, and she was amazed by the atmosphere. Marta could have abused her position to be a bully, to be brutal. Not at all. This core of 25 women, Hunya said, you know, she said, we were like a family, united in sorrow and joy. They're her words. And with this sense of community and camaraderie, they were able to regain a sense of humanity as well, which is so important when they were being treated as vermin, as lice by the Nazi perpetrators. So doing work that was meaningful to them, that connected them with their former lives, that was creative, that was also crucial. It wasn't demeaning. And even though they were being guarded by an SS guard, even though they were dressing SS women, they found their own ways to resist. And every once in a while, an eruption of anger that had to be very quickly squashed. And I wish I had time to tell you some of these incidences of defiance. But speaking of resistance, I do have to mention, and you can read a lot more in the book, that Marta was not only saving lives, and I estimate that in total, over the 3 years, I think 40 women and girls passed through this salon. So that was 40 people who had a far greater chance of survival, thanks to this woman. But she wasn't only helping the seamstresses. Marta was also a member of the underground resistance, the communist resistance in Auschwitz. And I think it's so important that people know that no matter how perilous and how improbable, Jewish people always had the wherewithal to resist, to defy. And I suppose living is an act of defiance, isn't it? Remembering your humanity is. But Marta was actively part of the resistance, both in terms of spreading information from illegal radio sets, smuggling messages out of Auschwitz. And she was also planning an escape if the famous escape by Rudolf Weber and Alfred Wetzler had not succeeded. Marta was the next to go. And you can read in the book what happens when Marta does escape. Quite a remarkable story for a very quietly remarkable woman. So, sewing, resistance, survival, and all the while dressing the SS in Auschwitz. I can tell you that researching this book has been a staggering experience. And you can read in the book what happens when Auschwitz is evacuated, what happens to these women. You can read what happens to the survivors when they come back to their hometowns, how they have to pick up the pieces again. And in fact, one of the first objects that the survivors look for is a sewing machine to start earning a living, to start reclothing themselves. Now they can cast off the rags of their camp existence, metaphorical rags and literal rags at the end of the death marches. And then also sewing wedding outfits and baby clothes as they start new lives and new families. But all the while, of course, that bottomless sorrow of having so many lost loved ones and having endured so much trauma. But I must emphasize that the women who survived the fashion salon, these dressmakers, their bonds of friendship remain so strong for many decades after the war. Whatever they endured or whatever they celebrated, they were there for each other. And it was wonderful to hear about this aspect of friendship, female friendship. Now I've got one more garment to show you before I'm done, and I do hope that we can have a bit of a chat afterwards if you have questions. And of course, I will welcome anyone who would like to contact me on my website, lucyadlington.com, if you have questions, or if you'd like to share any stories yourselves. I'm always eager to know more. But I've got one more garment to show you before I'm done, and it is the most precious thing in my collection. This is, well, I suppose it's unremarkable in many ways, although the most zinging fabric. This is a two-piece suit from the 1950s. It was originally a dress, a nice silky dress, but the owner of the dress knew that her young niece, Gila, needed a new suit. And so she converted her dress into a suit, and here it is. And when I first received this suit into my collection, the power of it was overwhelming. There's no label. There's nothing to say who made this, where it was made. But when I look at the stitches, I think of the hands that had a needle and thread in Auschwitz, because this suit was sewn by Hunya Volkman. She married again once she'd made it to Israel. Hunya stitched in Israel. She sewed for the elite fashion houses of Tel Aviv. And when the interest in bespoke clothing was overwhelmed by factory-made, ready-made clothes, she ended up doing factory sewing. She worked for the Gotek company that was founded by Leah Gottlieb in Israel. And I always, I'm actually going to show you. I know I said I had one more garment. I've got two. I have a Gotek swimsuit from the 1950s, and I don't know who made this. I bought it, just thinking it's worth remembering, isn't it? The clothes we wear. To think who made this garment, who stitched this. Was it Hunya? Maybe not. But there's always a story behind it. There's always a maker, and we often don't know the maker. But in this case, I know that Hunya made this suit for her niece Gila. And while Hunya sat and stitched, she told stories of her life in Slovakia before the war, of her time in Leipzig, of her time in Auschwitz, her time working with Marta and the other young women in the fashion salon. And as Hunya talked, Gila wrote. And Gila, aged only 15, collected Hunya's memoirs, essentially, in Hebrew. And it was one of the many documents I could use to write the Dressmakers of Auschwitz. So isn't that amazing? So I've given you a very brief, well, it seems brief to me. I would love to tell you so much more, a very brief introduction to these remarkable women. And Hunya herself said to Gila, she said, don't become a seamstress. She said, I know, it saved my life, but you just sit there and sew. And yet Marta, and I'll let you into a secret, Marta does survive. Marta said after the war, sewing saved my life. Why should I do anything else? So it's been my pleasure to record these women's lives and to follow Hunya's original intention when she wrote that fragmentary testimony for Dr. Laura Shelley, when she says that their names may not be forgotten. And I think that is overwhelmingly the most important aspect of my work. And I'm very pleased to say that this book, since it was published, has been remarkably successful. It's been published around the world. There will be 22 translations in different language, including a Hebrew translation coming up. And it was on the New York Times bestseller list for 6 months, which shows that there is still an interest in knowing and remembering and honoring. So thank you for your interest today. And now I will welcome your questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lucy. That was really fascinating on so many levels. If you do have questions for Lucy, please put them in the Q&A in the few minutes we have left. We do have some questions that have come in. Suzanne Korn says, and indeed Philippa Lester asks the same question, did any of the garments made in Auschwitz survive that you're aware of?
Almost undoubtedly, but we don't know what they are because they would not have a label. It wouldn't say, you know, made in Auschwitz. So that's one of the poignant things, is the creations of these women, these Jewish women, could be anywhere on the vintage market in Europe. And I did ask Hedwig Huss's, the commandant's wife, I asked her grandson, I said, do you know of any garments she kept? And the only garment from the war years that was retained was a little boy's waistcoat that had been stolen, you know, from the plunder warehouses, appropriated. But she didn't keep her 1940s clothes, Hedwig. She always dressed, you know, in the latest style of the decade. So the answer is, we don't know, but undoubtedly there will be these clothes with stories.
Where do you find clothes for your collection, and when you find them, how do you go about assessing the provenance? And you know, you obviously know an awful lot about the garments you've shared with us this evening. How do you find this out?
A lot of times I get donations now because I've worked for so many years lecturing around the UK and now speaking worldwide, that people like to donate garments because it's a way of keeping that sense of memory. So it might be, you know, a grandmother's garment, a grandfather's garment, or just something with a personal connection. And where possible, they give information via photographs and so on. So that element can be really personal, which is great. But there are other garments that you can only research according to the fabric and the labels, and you don't know the story. You can only speculate.
We have a question from Selma Avoth. I hope I've pronounced your surname properly, Selma. Did all 40 women survive?
No, is the short answer. But of the deaths that I know of, they were all during the evacuation, bar Berta Weiss, who established the salon with Marta. Berta died, I think, of typhus, possibly 1944. She lasted a long time. But there were women who were shot during the escape attempt. And I've detailed that in the book. These are the women that I'm finding hardest to discover anything about them, because they don't have family left to memorialize them either. But one quite remarkable moment, I was contacted by a family in the US who had read the book and noticed a name, and they'd said, that's our relative, that's Auntie Ella. And I said, oh, you know Ella? Well, tell me who she is. And they were able to share photographs. So that was a wonderful way of us connecting. But to my knowledge, most of the women that Marta gave a haven to, most of them either survived or had a much better chance at survival.
We have a question from Yvonne Cheney. Yvonne is one of our regular viewers in Southern California. And Yvonne asks, have you displayed your collection of items anywhere?
Well, I take the garments on tour. I give a range of different talks covering 200 years of social history. But wonderfully, there is actually going to be an exhibition about my collection at a Yorkshire museum, at a museum in the town of Halifax, which is another one with strong textile links. They have a fashion gallery there, which next year, all year, will be dedicated to my collection. And I'm hoping to feature some monogrammed garments belonging, or textiles belonging to Hunya, but so many different garments with stories. There's one, a coat I've just been given, worn by a Christian Polish woman who was taken from Warsaw by the Russians, went off to the Gulag for forced labor, and eventually made her way back to England wearing this coat. So lots of clothes with lots of stories, some of them happy too. So they will be on exhibition. And for those who aren't able to make it to the wonderful town of Halifax in Yorkshire, I will be doing a virtual tour of the exhibition, which I will be sharing via social media and so on. Well,
do let us know when that happens, and we'll certainly share it with our
You'll have to get over there. Get
Well, we will indeed. It's not far away for some of us. Bernice Rubinstein says, was it only women's clothes were made, or did children's clothes get made too? Were any of the seamstresses male?
So in the case of this book, I've been focusing on the women's stories because, I mean, there are so many stories, and there are an incredible number of specialist tailors and garment makers who are male. And every SS person seemed to have their own, they call them pet tailors, you know, whether they're in an extermination center or a concentration camp, they use Jewish talent wherever possible. And this particular fashion salon was for female clients and also children. So that, of course, is incredibly poignant, isn't it? To think that you're making adorable clothes for the children, innocent children, but nevertheless. And there's one story of a dressmaker called Lulu Grunberg, and she was working in the main part of the salon while Hedwig Huss had gone into the fitting room with Marta. And so little Hans Jürgen, the youngest, well, he was a small boy, Hedwig's youngest boy, he was out, you know, I suppose being babysat by these Jewish prisoners. And Lulu Grunberg, you know, she was living through this hell, and she just snapped, and she got hold of her tape measure, and she wrapped it around the little boy's neck and said, one day you're all going to die. You know, you're going to be hanged for this, your mother, your father, all of you. And then she obviously came to her senses and pulled the tape measure away. And the next day, Hedwig returned to the salon. She said, you know, it's really strange. The boy doesn't want to come back. So what a strange world it is, where, you know, some children are valued, but Jewish children were not. It's incredibly powerful. So yes, women's garments, beautiful evening gowns, day wear, and children's clothes. So much I could tell you about the male tailors, but not for this talk.
So we'll finish with a question from Suzanne Korn. Did women admit to being a client of the salon? Was it a matter of pride, or was it something that they would have kept to themselves?
This is really hard to know, because of course, having honest dialogue with perpetrators post-war was extremely difficult. And post-war, a lot of the focus was, inevitably, it was on men, it was on the male perpetrators. And it's only recently, in the last 20 years or so, that there have been mainly female academics who said, wait a minute, what about women? What about women perpetrators, bystanders, helpers, and so on? And so that now there's an increasing amount of work being done on female experiences and their contributions or their resistance. And yet, in many cases, it's too late. And in a way that the Allies could talk about their experiences as the victors, for the perpetrators, of course, there was the shame. No, I say, of course, there was the shame. Hedwig never felt shame, or I asked her grandson. No, she never expressed remorse, but she never talked about the women either. And there was certainly no sense that the SS felt they were, you know, doing something humane by using Jewish labor. In fact, Katka said, she said, we were not human to them. She said, we were dogs, they were the masters. So I don't think there was a sense of pride. It wasn't like, well, we managed to save some Jewish lives by, you know, giving them meaningful work. No, it was just purely vanity with them. And so to my knowledge, none of the SS wives were specifically interviewed about the fashion salon. It's one of the reasons we don't know so much about it until now.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us this evening. If you want to buy Lucy's book, there will be a link in the email we send out tomorrow, or it is available from most, or I would imagine all booksellers.
And also libraries as well. You don't have to buy it, you know, it's in the libraries, and it is on audiobook. If you don't mind a bit of a Yorkshire accent, it's me reading the audiobook.
Sounds even better. And of course, lucyadlington.com if you want to share any stories with Lucy. And to say thank you, I'm going to send you some of my photographs. This is the Israeli ambulance service in action, so hopefully you'll enjoy leafing through that.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, and it's been a real pleasure to join you. I really appreciate the invitation.
It's been a pleasure to have you. Now, let me just say a few words about our forthcoming programme before we leave you. We have an Israeli theme for the next couple of weeks. On the 15th of August, next week, Lana Melman will be discussing her book, Artists Under Fire, with me. This is about the anti-Israeli BDS movement and how that operates. Then on the 22nd of August, we have a programme about Beitar, the rise and fall of the most political football club in the world. And then we are back after the bank holiday with Jonathan Sandler discussing his graphic novel, The English GI. We have many more amazing speakers coming up. We're in fact booked to the end of the year. So please do visit our website at milim.org.uk to book your tickets and to make sure you sign up to our newsletter so that you don't miss anything. All our events are free, but you can make a small donation to help us with the cost of putting these events on. There will be a link in the chat and also on our website. So it remains for me to thank our guest, Lucy Adlington. Once again, thank you so much, Lucy. And looking forward to seeing you all again at a future event. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.